the first thing that you want. Two is you want to protect yourself, okay? And depending on what you're working with, if you notice some of the leather I have is thicker than others because it all depends what I'm working with, okay? And let's see if we can start. I haven't tried this yet, so let's see if we can do something with this. So the first thing you want to do is you want to create a platform, right? You want to create a location where you're going to hit the stone, and you want to look at the material. It's all about the angle, okay? If you don't make a platform, you're not going to get anything out of it, okay? And again, this is kind of a traditional tool. A grater. Again, I am a cheater. I have this little piece here, right? Just sharp knives, broke. But this, I've actually found it to be very, very good. Now, this is what I'm going to do right now is direct percussion, and what I'm going to do, okay? So this is what I usually use to see if the material that I have is actually good, right? If it will break. And again, there's different ways that you can do this. Again, you can just kind of hold it with your leg, or you can do it with your hand, right? And what you're going to do is you're going to see. And then you're going to start getting flakes, right? Now, what's a primary flake? A primary flake would be any kind of flake that has cortex, right? Whether it's 100% of cortex or it's 5% of cortex, it's going to be a primary flake. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the size. People think, oh, primary flake has to be big. Not necessarily. You can have a small little piece. If it has cortex, it's actually a primary flake. So this will be an example, right? I use this because this is really, really heavy and it will tend to break anything that I'm working with, okay? See, this will be, again, a primary flake. So let me just see if I can clean it a little bit. So we're just going to start reducing bilaterally the piece, okay? And this is also the reason too why you always want to go outwards and you don't necessarily want to go inwards, right? If I start doing this, I'm going to get myself, right? So you want to be very, very careful. Again, use whatever it feels comfortable for you. And this is kind of the experimentation you're all going to have to go through. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time. It's pretty hard. And again, I had not tried this jerk before, so I'm also kind of seeing just how it works. And again, too, sometimes you think that in order to have a tool, you need to have a complete bilateral artifact. And that might not be the case. If you have a flake that you can hold or you can have somewhere, you're going to be able to use it, right? So you're actually going to find in the archaeological context a lot of flakes that are tools, right? And what makes it a tool? Once it's been used, it becomes a tool. And maybe if they only cut one thing, it becomes a tool. And how can you tell if it becomes a tool? If you look at the edges, right, when it's brand new, it's going to be straight. If you use it for anything, it's going to get what we call serrated, right? It's going to have a little kind of break on the edge, okay? All right, so I think it will work.
Okay, good.
Now let me use one of these ones because I know this is much nicer material and it would definitely break. Does anybody have any questions yet?
Yeah.
You said a primary flake is something that has cortex. What is that?
So cortex is
Yeah, like the outer rougher part of the stone.
kind of like the exactly.
So it's not a material that's all there.
It's because you can tell. So usually what you get, especially for flint, is you get nodules, right? It's just the way it forms. Sometimes you're actually going to have deposits where it's called a vein, right? So you're not going to have cortex, but most of the flint that I've seen, you're always going to have a cortex, even with obsidian too. For instance, you go to a source of obsidian, and you're actually looking at the material itself in its raw state. You're going to see that it's going to have cortex. Also, once it's been napped, a lot of the times too, as time goes on, it's going to get exposure to the sun, to the wind, to water. It's going to create a different platform, I guess you can call it, and that's called a patina, right? And that is just going to tell you that it's been exposed to the environment. So also, and again, this is something that you get with practice. Patina is different than a cortex, right? As a cortex, it's kind of like the natural state of material, and the idea is, again, since we study technology, by looking at whether or not it has cortexes, you can start recreating whether it's a primary flake. So a primary flake is always going to have cortex. What we just did right now, like all this flakes are going to be a primary flake, right? Because it's basically the first stage of production in your stage, in your chain of patois, right? In your chain of productions or the chain of events that are happening to produce something. Like if you look at this material, it doesn't have. Here you have this will be more a patina, right? So this is something that has been exposed to the environment for a really long time. But it's not necessarily the same thing as cortex, when that is kind of like the geologic formation. The crystal structure would be this itself. And also, again, any kind of raw material that has a good crystal structure, you're gonna be able to nap it. So you're gonna be able to use it. And that's something, again, when I was working at Southwest, a lot of things that I personally would not necessarily use to flint nap, these guys were using. So you're even gonna find a lot of the times, that they picked up a piece, they broke it, but they kind of saw that it wasn't good enough, so they just dropped it right there. And you have kind of like the whole sequence of production right there, where they were actually trying to work with a piece of stone, but it just was not good enough for them to do anything with it. Two is also a lot of the times you kind of want to have an initial idea of what you want to do, but sometimes too the material will tell you what you're supposed to do, right? Let me see if I can make.
How do you take a piece off at an angle like that rather than just take off a
So there's different ways that you can do it, but yeah, it's basically the angle. The other technique is the pressure technique, right? Where you're basically using pressure to take it out. But for that, you need to prepare the core first, too. And yeah, flint napping, you kind of have to sit down and work with it for a while. I was actually talking to Cameron. Perhaps we can kind of create a space where people can just come in and do flint napping whenever you want. You can be in there for hours just talking and also learning from each other. I've learned a lot from different people. And again, the direct percussion, it's usually going to be your initial chain of, initial sequence of production. Once you get into a smaller, for instance, once you get into a flake, right, what you're going to start doing is you can either use a smaller hammer, right, or you can actually start doing pressure, what we call a pressure technique, right, which is kind of working the edges to create the, and again, it all depends what you're making and how fast you want to go. Usually when you're learning, I recommend you go in slower, right? So that's going to give you the edges to start working.
And Dr. Silva, you have a question right there.
Yes. Sorry.
What is that little tool that you're, like a little silver looking kind of stone thing that you were kind of using?
This is just a sharpener, and I use it instead of using the stone. I use this. This is just to create the platform. This is just to create the area where I'm gonna strike it or where I'm gonna hit it. If you don't do this, your stone is just you're not. You need to have it kind of ground so that when you strike it, the strike is actually gonna hit. It's gonna hit the platform in a way that it's actually gonna fracture the stone. So because if not, it won't do it.
Just creating microfractures.
Yeah. So it all depends how fast you want to go. And also, again, this is the reason, right, why you want to do flint knapping, because when you're doing your analysis, you're going to be able to understand what kind of flake this is, right? And yes, you're going to cut yourself, right? It's going to happen. So again, sometimes you kind of want to go faster, right? Because you want to first you need to create what we call the your initial preform, right? And then from your preform, you're going to start working it so that you can actually create a point, or you can actually create something that looks more as what they made, right? Two, sometimes you might not have a lot of materials to use. What I recommend is use glass, right? Obviously, it has a different composition, so it's going to work differently. And I'm actually going to show you. I wanted to show everybody a little trick that I learned on, especially if you find bottles that are kind of flat in the bottom, right? You can use this piece. This is how I created that one. And what you do, get a large piece of nail, put it in, okay? And then I want to move back. And you kind of start going around it. Bottom might be too big. And what you want to do is you want to have the nail kind of hit the side. Let me use the bigger one. Doesn't want to do it. With glass.
We're using the pointed end, not fracture it, right?
It's usually just what you want to do is get the sides and the whole bottom will come up.
Oh, hey!
So you get the whole bottom, and then you can also use it. And this is kind of a very cheap, easy way to do it. But again, as you guys see, it's kind of concave, right? It's not fully straight. So you do want to get bottles that are straight in the bottom. And again, you can use this the same way that I'm using it, right? You can actually use it to do some flint knapping. But again, this is going to be a lot more sharper, so you want to be very, very careful when you're working with it. On the other hand, depending on the color you have, you can actually make a very nice biface. And now, what's a biface? A biface is any kind of artifact that has been worked on both sides. Something that you're all going to see in the literature is that there's even not, you can find a lot of disagreement in lithic studies, right? One of the things that I always tell people is you have to learn how to agree to disagree, right? I might call it a biface, you might call it a knife, and you're going to call it a spear point, right? But we're all talking about the same thing, and that's very, very common. So it also depends who you're reading, right? And there's kind of like different schools of thought when it comes to lithics. The European terminology, right? And then you have the American, and then you also have the Latin American, way of terming things. I personally like to use a biface because I find it to be much more neutral. I don't know if it was a knife, I don't know if it was a spear point, but it's work on both sides, and that's the logic that I use behind this, right? On why do I call it a biface instead of calling it something else. Now the advantage of using glass too is that it's a lot easier to work than flint. Flint can be very, very hard. So yeah, does anybody have any questions, any comments? And I want to kind of stop here in a second too, so you can all kind of get your hands dirty, because that's what this is about, right? Giving you guys a chance. And again, just remember with the techniques, what you want to do is just be careful, always go outwards. What I say too, and today is really about breaking stone, right? Because we're not going to have the time for you guys to make a complete piece. But I want you to really start seeing, get the feeling for it, right? How does it feel? I love the sound. When you've been flintknapping for a while, that sound when it breaks and you get a crack, it's like just so nice. And when you're making something, and also to see how long this technology took. But two, especially again my experience in the Southwest or Mesoamerica, this guy's had complete change of production, where you would basically have individuals that were doing the initial work, and then you have people who are basically specialized in doing the final work. So for instance, I don't know if many of you have heard about Teotihuacan, which is kind of like this huge place in the Valley of Mexico. We've actually found or we think that they were controlling one of the major obsidian sources in the region. And workshops have been found there. And even at those workshops, you can find they were making preforms, right? And they were standardized, and they were sending them out. So what you were getting actually shipped out of there were not the complete pieces of obsidian, but you were getting the preforms, with the porters that would just basically go down and distribute them through a market system. Now, for instance, here in the East, right, there has been cases. I know, for instance, obsidian from the Southwest being found in New Jersey, right? And it wasn't that they were basically put on a train, or one individual was going all the way to New Jersey. What you really need to think about obsidian and the beauty about, especially with obsidian, when we can source it, we can pinpoint it to where it's coming from, is that it's going to allow us to reconstruct the whole, really start thinking of how this object got there, right? And you're talking of people, right, exchanging things probably. So it probably made it from, just to give an example, maybe a source in Arizona or Northern California, and how it started moving little by little, right, until it made it all the way up to New Jersey, or all the way down here. I'm not sure if there's obsidian down here from the Southwest, but maybe there is.
Very
Obviously,
but some.
this, yeah, I mean, you're not going to find lots of them. Maybe, you're going to find 1 or 2 or 3, very few of them. But this is telling you about how objects are moving in space, and how we can actually talk about the history of the object.